Hello everyone, today I want to talk about how some senior US officials have had a change of heart, jointly stating that China has been complying with trade agreements. Additionally, the US Secretary of Defense has been very explicit, stating that America's national security strategy stipulates that the US and China each have their own spheres of influence. The US leads in the Americas and Europe, while China leads in the Pacific. After the US announced its 2025 national security strategy, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth further clarified America's policy towards China. On December 6th, Hegseth attended the Reagan National Defense Forum held in Simi Valley, California. In his speech, he elaborated on US President Trump's national security strategy, claiming that the US does not intend to suppress China's growth, does not want to dominate or humiliate China, and has no intention of changing the status quo in the Hegseth explained the White House's newly announced national security strategy more clearly, saying that the US should put its own interests first and abandon idealistic utopian thinking in favor of pragmatic realism. Hegseth said in his speech that the Trump administration is moving towards a path that recognizes great power spheres of influence. China dominates the Pacific region, while the US maintains its dominant position in the Western Hemisphere and all of Europe. Russia should be downplayed. Hegseth boasted that the Trump administration has abandoned utopian idealism and shifted to a firm, realist national security strategy. He said the US should not be distracted by nation-building, interventionism, ambiguous wars, regime change, climate change, woke sermons, and some ineffective domestic projects. They should put the country's actual interests first. Hegseth said the Trump administration's core objective is to protect the security, freedom, and prosperity of the United States and the American people. He went on to speak about the mission of the US Department of Defense. He said they will focus on 4 key work streams. First, defending the US homeland and the Western Hemisphere. Second, deterring China through strength but not confronting China. Third, increasing burden sharing between the US and its allies and partners. Fourth, strengthening America's defense industrial base. Hegseth said that on the diplomatic front, although various countries' defense strategies in recent years have all focused on deterring China, Hegseth said that the strategy the US proposes for China will be relatively moderate. He added that the US will respect China's military expansion, but at the same time stressed that it will remain clear-eyed about China's rapid and comprehensive military development. He further explained US-China relations, saying the Trump administration seeks to build a stable, peaceful, fair trade, and mutually respectful relationship with China. The Department of Defense will also be committed to strengthening communication with the Chinese military to avoid miscalculation and de-escalate conflict. He claimed this is a flexible, realist policy, not for the purpose of dominating the other side, but for achieving a balance of power. Hegseth reiterated the position he stated earlier this year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, that the US does not intend to contain China's growth, does not want to dominate or humiliate China, and has no intention of changing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. Regarding policy in the Indo-Pacific region, Hegseth said that America's interests in the Indo-Pacific are extremely important. But America's sphere of interest is limited and reasonable. The goal is to ensure that America's allies will not be subjected to continuous and successful military aggression. He claimed that the US must have a clear-eyed understanding of China's rapid, large-scale, and comprehensive military buildup. Not taking China seriously is not only foolish, it also appears disrespectful. Furthermore, Hegseth said the Trump administration will ask allies to take on more defense responsibilities. He said, "Our allies are not children. We can and should expect them to do their part." He praised countries like South Korea, Poland, and Germany for their recent moves to increase defense spending. He stressed that America's allies must step up and contribute to collective defense. At the same time, he also stressed the need to establish a Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine. The US will restore its military dominance in the Western Hemisphere, using it to protect the homeland and key geographical corridors, and to prevent adversaries from making military deployments in the Western Hemisphere. A VOA News analysis suggests that, judging from Sprague's remarks and actions, the Trump administration will likely move toward a relatively moderate strategy. This means emphasizing America's influence in the Western Hemisphere and Europe, while at the same time acknowledging China's ever-expanding influence in the Pacific region. Sprague's interpretation of the US national security strategy is more direct, and from it we can identify several new lines of thinking for the US regarding China. First, implementing a Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine. The US maintains its dominant position in the Western Hemisphere and all of Europe, while China dominates the Pacific region. Each has its own sphere of influence, with mutual respect. Second, the US will pursue a realist national security strategy. The US will not engage in global democracy building, interventionism, or regime change, nor will it launch pointless wars. In other words, the US will neither seek to change China's regime or its system, nor does it want to dominate or humiliate China. it doesn't even intend to contain China's growth and has no intention of changing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. This is an attitude of great power coexistence rather than an attitude of needing to suppress China at all costs. Third, on the military front, although Hegseth still talks about deterring China through strength, he made it clear that the strategy the US proposes for China will be relatively moderate. He even explicitly stated that the US will respect China's military expansion and not confront China. He declared that the US is not aiming to dominate China, but to achieve a balance of power. In other words, the US needs to strengthen its own military. While it's said to be for deterring China, the goal is not to overwhelm China, but simply for self-preservation, seeking to achieve a military balance of power with China. Fourth, this American approach is a new isolationist line. For China, this is a good thing, not a bad thing. With China and the US each having their own sphere of influence, the two countries can negotiate, making it easier to achieve a balance of power and avoid conflict. And countries like Japan and the Philippines will also lose their backer for challenging China. After the US announced its national security strategy, there has been a noticeable change in the attitude of US officials toward China. In the past, when the US media talked down China, US officials would invariably echo them, but recently that has changed. Last month, Bloomberg reported that although China and the US had reached a trade agreement and China should have increased its purchases of American soybeans according to the deal, in reality, China's purchases of American soybeans seem to have stalled. Then on the 3rd of this month, Bloomberg reported again that China had only purchased 2.25 million tons of soybeans, far below the purchase amount promised to the US. US Trade Representative Gary Yee, in an interview with Fox News on January 7th, clearly stated that China has always complied with the terms of the US-China bilateral trade agreement. This was a direct response to Bloomberg's claim that China's soybean purchases had stalled. Gary Yee said that all recent agreements reached between the US and China are very clear, and so far it appears the Chinese side has been consistently abiding by the relevant commitments. On the closely watched issue of soybean purchases, Gary Yee said that China has already completed 1/3 of its purchase commitment for the current marketing year. This purchasing progress stands in contrast to Bloomberg's earlier reports. In addition to Gary Yee, US Treasury Secretary also said on a CBS program that although China will not accelerate its purchasing pace, their related soybean purchases are still expected to be completed within the current crop year. He also said that recently, the price of US soybeans has risen by 12 to 15%. According to data from the US Department of Agriculture, in 2014, soybeans accounted for about 20% of US cash crop receipts, valued at approximately $46.8 billion US. A quarter of that was sold to China. However, due to the trade war initiated by the Trump administration, China suspended purchases of US agricultural products for several months starting early this year, causing US farmers to lose billions of dollars. As US-China relations eased, the White House announced last month that China has agreed to purchase at least 12 million tons of US soybeans in the current marketing year, and at least 25 million tons of US soybeans annually for the next 3 years. US Secretary of Agriculture Lawrence said on January 24th that she is fully confident China will fulfill its soybean purchase commitment. She said, all indications are that their commitment is real, and I'm confident they will buy 12 million tons of soybeans this quarter. In fact, high-level economic and trade officials from China and the US have maintained communication since the two heads of state met in South America at the end of December. On December 5th, Vice Premier Haley Fink video-called Besant and Greer for in-depth, constructive talks on cooperation and concerns, vowing to extend cooperation lists, shrink disputes, and steadily improve ties. The CEO of the US Soybean Export Council has also said that China is a critically important market for the US soybean industry. The US Soybean Export Council has been working in China since 1982. For 37 years now, the US soybean industry has long cultivated the Chinese market and has built a very strong network of relationships. This is why the Chinese market is difficult to replace. All signs indicate that US-China trade frictions have cooled down rapidly. Both China and the US are moving forward according to their respective commitments. In fact, from China's perspective, buying American soybeans is just a small matter. As long as the relationship between the two sides is good, it's not a problem at all for China to buy at least 25 million tons of US soybeans annually for the next 3 years. That's only about 8 to 16 billion US dollars worth of soybeans each year. This amount is also similar to the quantity of US soybeans China purchased annually in the past.